I didn't think I'd ever play the Dark Souls games. I had tried playing Bloodborne, but after 4 hours trying to make it to the second checkpoint, I basically wrote it off as something I'd never even be able to do, compounded by a popular reputation that defines From Software titles mostly in terms of controller smashing difficulty. I wrote off the games especially hard on account of the community's rallying catchphrase, "Get good," an exhortation to suck it up and deal with getting your ass kicked over and over and over again, with a heaping helping of irritating moral judgment if you decide that there are actually better things to do with your time than try to make your little action figure hit the other guy in just the right way. In November 2021, when Dark Souls won the Golden Joystick Award for Ultimate Game of All Time, I was kind of confused. Wasn't Dark Souls, in a fundamental way, kind of a niche title? Wasn't the entire point that only self-ordained gods of gaming can beat it, and that the only reason that I would try it myself is so that those people would have someone to laugh at? Ultimate Game of All Time is a hell of a statement to make. As someone trying to make their way through the keystone franchises of the medium, it wasn't just a statement, it was kind of a professional imperative. I'd felt pretty secure most of my life ignoring the hell out of the Dark Souls games as something for other people with wildly different tastes. Ultimate Game of All Time, though, that's harder to ignore. It basically necessitates some kind of opinion, agree, disagree. The only bad answers seem to be I don't know and I don't care. So I decided I'd finally give it an in-depth try. I went in with a lot of loaded expectations. Absolutely none of them were true. Not a single one. I was wrong about the Dark Souls games being arbitrarily difficult. I was wrong about them being primarily about the bragging rights of players. I was wrong about them being boring or monotone or any number of assumptions I made based on the reputation they have of being the hard ones. Each of the Dark Souls games is a wildly different experience from one another, but all of them share one fundamental trait that broke down all the barriers that I had assumed would be insurmountable to me. That trait is flexibility. These are some of the most thoughtfully, cleverly mutable action titles I've seen in my entire life. Anyone can play them. They are not remotely insurmountable. I surmounted them, and pretty much every video I ever made inevitably gets a comment that goes something like, I wanted to watch this, but your disgusting ineptitude at even the most basic elements of gameplay made me literally want to vomit. By the time I was done with the trilogy, I wasn't just impressed, I was a fan, not simply in the will positively name-check during conversation way that's regular. I talked about Dark Souls to friends who didn't want to talk about it. I drove my wife up the goddamn wall with my bullshit. I even ordered merch, which is something I've done like twice in the past decade. I felt more enthusiastic and enthralled by these 3 games than really any of the past 3 dozen or more that I've played. I can barely remember a time since I was a teenager that I felt this excited about a game. Another reason why I never imagined that I would really play these games, let alone become completely obsessed with them, is that it seems like anyone who plays Dark Souls and then talks on the internet for a living ends up making a video essay about them. It is hopelessly oversaturated. I mean, I remember a few years back when one guy had a negative opinion on Dark Souls 2, another guy countered with a double-length argument in its favor, and then some third jackass shows up to make a 10-hour rebuttal trying to prove once and for all with science that no one is allowed to enjoy Dark Souls 2. Who wants to stick their nose in all of that? In the years since, the pile of print essays, video essays, lore analysis, and bathroom graffiti devoted to Dark Souls has only grown. Well, here's mine. Just toss it on the fucking stack, because I get it now. If you like Dark Souls, it's hard to shut up about Dark Souls, because the act of overcoming the games and getting through them is a deeply personal experience to each player. I feel like I really did something, like I did something special and interesting, just like all the many thousands of people who played it before me. My goal then here isn't to say that one game is any better than another, or that any one style of play is correct, or that there even is a singular Dark Souls experience to be had. The beauty of the games is that there isn't any such singular path, any such unifying metric. Each human being who endeavors to see these games through from one end to another will face different struggles and overcome those struggles uniquely. I want to tell the story of my path. I want to talk about how these games took my expectations, crushed them, and presented me with an experience much more gorgeously complex than I'd ever guessed from the endless repetition of get good. I want to talk about them for the exact same reason as everyone else. People like talking about the experiences that change them. I sure made a lot of people mad when I made a God of War retrospective in which I pretty much refused to use the block button. Playing on a lower difficulty accommodated me on this, and I found the game plenty difficult anyway and essentially ignoring this key mechanic. I just like to play God of War aggressively, and they let me do it how I wanted by just turning the difficulty down. That seemed like a fine arrangement to me. Infamously, the Dark Souls games do not have an adjustable difficulty. On the surface. The first few hours have a difficulty mostly determined by starting class, but very quickly the player can begin investing points in attributes that, alone, mitigate some individual element of the difficulty and, cumulatively, lower the overall difficulty as you go along. I'll talk about it much more later on, but I even played through on the New Game Plus mode, which lets you start over with your earned inventory and point investments. Despite largely doubling the damage output and health totals of most enemies in the game, including bosses, New Game Plus is a cakewalk in comparison to your first time through. It's basically a revenge tour where you get to put out a cigarette in the eyes of every boss who ever looked at you funny the first time around. Your attribute choices gradually, steadily reduce the difficulty. The way death works in the game essentially allows you to collect bonus points and extra levels from your failures and experiments, meaning that if you go in with lower innate player skill and reflexes than other people, you can constantly and adequately mitigate that difference with mechanical power. Consider the most popular kind of Dark Souls challenge run, the Souls Level 1 game. In this mode, which is strictly on the honor system and not part of the explicit design at all, a player chooses not to ever take any attribute points, instead relying on found items and a player's mastery of the in-game systems to survive. It is entirely possible to beat the whole game this way. The appeal of the Souls Level 1 run is that it does create a unified baseline of experience that actually isn't there otherwise. Each player will face the same challenges with the same tools. Some folks will even say that's the real Dark Souls experience, a common refrain in the literally endless arguments that these games generate. Thing is, that baseline has to be created because Dark Souls otherwise has no standard of experience between players. Once players start investing attribute points, they begin facing unpredictable levels of challenge with a widely varying toolset. Not only is the difficulty unique to players based on personal skill going into the game, class and damage output choices further fracture the baseline difficulty of the game. Some bosses are pushovers for casters, some will utterly stomp a magic user in a way they won't for the sword and board types. Sword and board types struggle to deal elemental damage that some bosses are weak against. Some players invest in high damage output, some players in durability stats, some try to balance them, and by the time New Game Plus rolls around, you're likely to be fearsome and durable to the point that even doubling the health of a boss doesn't make them difficult again. To ignore the attribute system for a Soul Level 1 attempt is to ignore the fact that Dark Souls actually does have a variable difficulty. It's just very granular, atomized across several statistics that make things just a tiny, tiny bit easier for every point you invest. Soul Level 1 is the real Dark Souls, only in that it is the single truly standardized way to approach the game. Consider, though, how I refused to engage with the block mechanic in God of War to make the game a little easier sensibly for myself. Is that any more or less an unintended variation in how Souls Level 1 playthroughs use a mechanical refusal to create a harder experience for a player? At the heart of the debate over difficulty is a debate about whether a player should be able to customize a game experience around a developer's intended experience, to bypass certain things for convenience or comfort. To say that Dark Souls has a fixed difficulty, you have to actually ignore the core systems of advancement. Folks online really love to talk about how Dark Souls can't ever have an easy mode because it violates the developer's intention that you struggle to earn your victory. That is almost completely opposite to my experience with Dark Souls 1. The impression I got at almost every turn from the game is that it did want me to win. It wanted me to keep going. And if I said to the game, hey man, I sure could use another couple hundred hit points, all I had to do was go grinding for a time or even just struggle and fail, and my wish would be granted. It pleases people to overemphasize the difficulty because it reflects better on their victory, imbues it with more meaning. I'm not setting out to deliberately burst anyone's bubble, but even I, the lowliest of stoners, beat this game. And I did it because the essential mechanics of Dark Souls 1 actually supported me and wanted me to thrive. The hilarious thing is that Dark Souls 1 did teach me, finally, to block. I didn't do it because I had to, though. I did it because I wanted to. I did it because I was persuaded by how much easier it made the basics of combat. Early on, you get a pretty good shield. I mean, within the first, hour of play. I looked at the stats and I did a double take. Surely it didn't actually block 95% of all incoming physical damage, with other shields that went up to a full 100% reduction. Well, they do. Your stamina gauge can be used for both attack and defense. You can spend to make a swing, you can spend to take a swing. Especially on early game enemies, if they attack you while you're blocking, it causes a kind of recoil animation, allowing a window for you to make a safe aggression against them. The shield gave me confidence in the early game that I desperately needed. Yeah, this is a game where you die in just a couple hits, but those hits have to break through. By blocking, you can actually take many, many more hits than your health pool would otherwise allow. Through blocking, enemies are rendered more vulnerable during their stagger animation. There are other playstyles that offer opportunities for bigger damage attacks or more acrobatic and exciting combat approaches, but the basic and simple sword and board setup is another example of difficulty being atomized across smaller advancement choices, as opposed to being condensed into a menu choice. One-handed with shield is the most fundamentally conservative choice going into combat. Not politically, obviously, but conservative in its unwillingness to risk much of anything. Big attacks can knock you down through your shield, staggering you off balance, but this is even mitigated by a secondary statistic called poise. Heavier armors have higher poise, but there are rings in the game that allow for massive poise bonuses, allowing light and medium armors to be more effective than their class in direct melee, and also other rings that increase carry weight in general, allowing you to use heavy armors without the intended disadvantages to your roll speed and its utility. The game is differently difficult in a myriad of ways and offers an equally gigantic array of trinkets and mechanics that reduce and mitigate those difficulties at every turn. Choice of starting class is a big part of that. I'd heard and read that casters, either arcane or divine, had a pretty easy go of it compared to pure melee builds, but you have to invest in attributes related to those disciplines. There is a third caster choice, Pyromancer. Pyromancers cast from a flame held in the hand, and instead of being tied to a statistic, damage is scaled based purely off of how much you upgrade the flame. It takes as much to level the flame to its absolute maximum as to level an attribute close to its functional maximum, so what differentiates it? Because it runs in parallel to the attribute advancement system, instead of being integrated with it. Every time you invest a point in a stat, it gets more expensive to purchase the next one. This is a shoehorn mechanic that prevents a player from picking a spot and just grinding it into the ground. It's fine to grind a few levels here and there, but you need to move on to bigger and more worthy monsters to keep up with the price after a while. Pyromancy's independence from that means that even if you've been over-leveling like I had, it remains comparatively inexpensive to keep boosting the Pyromancy flame. Less than the cost of a level, mostly, with the exception of early in the game and also the last couple investments. So, for my actual stats, I focused on just 3: Vitality, Stamina, and Strength. One made me more durable, one made me more flexible in how I could attack and defend, and the other made it so that with the right weapon, I was cutting enemies down in just a couple swings, as they had done to me in the early game. I was a warrior, primarily, but the Pyromancy flame did essentially free bonus damage at range to powerful enemies I was otherwise struggling with in toe-to-toe encounters. Pyromancy allowed me to further alter the balance of difficulty in my favor, another tool to counter and negate certain aspects of the challenge. There was no condensed menu option for easy, but I found the easier option nonetheless. I ended up feeling so comfortable with the build that when I went on to Dark Souls 2, I abandoned Pyromancy and went for an all-melee build instead, taking the lessons I learned with the advantage I originally had and trying to see how I did along a slightly different path to victory. I ended up very happy with each of the 3 classes and approaches I chose in each of the 3 games. For Dark Souls 1, I chose a class and a method of play that kept me safer and better protected than the other approaches. By the time New Game Plus was over, I had a list of completely different things I was interested in trying. I was hooked by then. I'm not sure if I would have reached that point without having had a back pocket full of fireballs right from the get-go. Each of the Dark Souls games is relatively independent of the others, and they can basically be played in any order, but I think if you've never played them before, it's advantageous to start from the start with a remastered version of the first game. Neither of the subsequent games are so interested in using the progression of bosses as an educational experience. Dark Souls 1 will train a player in the boss templates and combat encounters that the subsequent 2 games will continually experiment with and riff off of. It'll train a player in these things with a naturally escalating progression, carefully layering one after another as a series of lessons. If you remember them that way going forward, as lessons, the complexity of future bosses is made a little bit more immediately plain than if you began with one of the other two games. And conversely, if you start with those, these early encounters may seem quaint and underwhelming by comparison. The very first boss is in the tutorial area, the Asylum Demon. Dark Souls 1 and 3 have what are exit exam boss fights, big challenges that perch right on top of the basic tutorializing about movement and attack that you'd expect. The first thing the Asylum Demon tries to teach you is to run. You need to run past it, complete the rest of the tutorial, and then return to be able to do significant damage to it. When you come back, you attack it from above, getting a free head start on damage. Unless you chose black firebombs as your starting gift, then you can just kill him right away, no problem. Which is another important lesson in itself. Many enemies, including the biggest, have hidden